I have great pleasure in welcoming His Excellency Paolo Gentiloni, President of the Council of Ministers of the Republic of Italy, to address the General Assembly.
Mr. President, Secretary General, my fellow delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I cannot begin my statement without addressing some thoughts to a friendly country that has been struck by a serious natural disaster, Mexico, which we send our solidarity to the families of the victims and our encouragement to the relief workers. Our assembly, the 72nd session of the General Assembly, is taking place in a complex and constantly moving global context. The socio-economic effects of globalization, which can create hardship and inequalities, also compound the persistence of major instability in the international geopolitical framework. The world seems more and more unpredictable, especially when it has to address extraordinary situations that the international community must prove able to overcome obstacles and look at the future with trust. The signals of optimism which accompany the resumption of our economy give us hope, and it's up to us to guide this road to development with responsibility and courage. We must do so first through better governance of global processes to assure robust and inclusive economic growth aimed primarily at reducing inequalities. Italy is convinced that building democratic, pluralistic, and inclusive societies open to diversity is not only an ethical imperative, but also the best guarantee of peace and stability. And as such, a fundamental piece of a broader commitment to promoting and guaranteeing effective protection of the human rights and fundamental freedoms of each individual. Dear colleagues, we have an experience in Europe that the shared journey of hopes and gains undertaken by the European Union, which for Italy represents the first natural dimension of multilateralism. This journey teaches us that in the face of the challenges of our day, we must have the courage to react. In the past 2 years, the European Union has been forced, perhaps for the first time, to abandon with difficulty to tackle some of the greatest challenges to have emerged since the post-war period. It has not been easy, nor has it been the beginning of the end, which many had feared, but rather an opportunity for a powerful collective reminder of the need to remain united within the European project. Today, I affirm with profound conviction that a new European impetus exists, the will to proceed as one, to bring the European project closer to the needs of citizens, the challenges of economic growth, security, and migration, a project that strengthens the global role of the Union in the world. And there's such a great need, a global role inspired by multilateralism, free exchange, and respect for rule of law. In short, this story regards all of us because the European Union, which is able to give back to the whole world an example of solidarity, progress, prosperity, and effectiveness, is a contribution to the progress and the development of the whole world. The development of social, economic, and political inclusiveness extended also to the labor market and fighting poverty and marginalization also means for Italy contributing to a more effective management of the challenge of migration. We must respond with compassion, intelligence, and vision to the reality, the permanent reality of the vast human movements of our days. For years, Italy has been engaged in operations to rescue and receive migrants. We have saved and continue to save hundreds of thousands of persons who risked drowning in the Mediterranean. True to our ethical and moral imperatives and to the international obligations we have freely undersigned. We are proud of this. But to consolidate our action, we need a global response, a general response to the migration phenomenon. It cannot only be assigned to the generosity of some territories, knowing that there are nations in the world that are struck by migratory flows in an even larger and more serious manner than us Italians, and to continue to affirm and embody the principle, or these principles, Italy is participating actively in the negotiations that will lead in the UN framework to global compacts. Our proposal to jointly address the migration phenomenon on a global level is based on three main pillars: investing in support of the countries of origin and transit, protecting the most vulnerable refugees and migrants, and valuing the many positive aspects and opportunities created by migration. Italy is already the promoter of a true partnership with the African countries. Because if there is one thing that must be clear in these years, it is that the future of Europe is also being played out in Africa. It is by investing in Africa that we can address the deep causes of migration, first and foremost, economic and demographic inequalities. We have been working with the International Organization for Migration and the UN High Commission of Refugees to provide assistance to migrants with respect to their human rights, to assure the protection of refugees fleeing from wars and persecutions, and to offer favorable conditions and incentives for their voluntary repatriation and reduce the power of human traffickers, which is the only condition to create progress for legal migration, which is also to the benefit of our countries and to not jeopardize the lives of migrants, to protect the weak, the weakest, because saving the lives of the last and the weakest is also action to save our values. Saving the lives of children allows us to save our societies, our honor, and our future. Mr. President, fellow delegates, for Italy, by virtue of our geography and history, our emphasis on security and stabilization and sustainable development and growth of the Mediterranean and of the African continent as a whole. All of this in the perspective of the fight against terrorism and violent extremism. We know that the more and more clear apparent loss of ground for Daesh in Iraq and Syria has demonstrated that the effectiveness of our work. But we also know that victory on the ground is not enough. The fanaticism and ideology of Daesh and of jihadism continue to claim victims and sow terror in our cities, in the cities of half the world. Italy is an active partner in the global coalition against Daesh, engaged in various activities, starting with the presence of our soldiers in Iraq, and the second largest contingent of the coalition after the American contingent. but it's because we are engaged with our military forces that we remember, that we recall to ourselves and to everyone that the fight against terrorism requires a multidimensional force. I'm thinking of the initiatives of countering and the use of the internet and the social media by terrorists. We will speak of it today at the United Nations, or the financing of terrorist groups, or of investments that we must make to promote culture and inclusiveness in our neighborhoods and in the neighborhoods of our cities. We have dedicated great energy in the Security Council, the General Assembly, and as the G7 presidency to upgrade our capacities to respond to the new threats which are ever evolving posed by terrorist groups. Libya is the key to restoring to the central Mediterranean its historic role as a driver of civilization and to counter the risks and these threats. Its stabilization, as we said this morning, is a priority objective that must involve the rejection of every unrealistic hypothesis of a military solution or division of the country. Italy is a leader in this commitment, and we look with great satisfaction at the returning of the United Nations action as a leader in Libya at the political level and at the level of assistance to refugees and migrants. We have an opportunity to relaunch the political process and prepare the new elections. The opportunity is today. It is in our hands and in the hands of the United Nations. Syria continues to be a source of concern and suffering. Let us not forget it. After 6 years of unspeakable violence, millions of refugees and hundreds of thousands of deaths, we welcome the recent efforts to promote local truces and de-escalation zones. But let us also remember that the only road to a lasting solution to the Syrian conflict is a realistic and credible political process. There can be no stability, peace, and reconstruction, nor a lasting victory over terrorism, or the conditions for the voluntary return of refugees in complete security without an inclusive political transition that brings together the various components of Syrian society. This is why I wish to reaffirm today in the General Assembly our full support for the role of the United Nations and of our special envoy de Mistura, and at the same time urge support from the main regional and international stakeholders for the roadmap outlined by Resolution 2254. And finally, ultimately, there could be no true peace without justice. This means ascertaining the responsibilities of those who have committed atrocity crimes in these years, starting with the use of chemical weapons. Dialogue and reconciliation are indispensable instruments for a lasting peace also on the African continent. Italy has intensified and systematized its actions for the Sahel region, particularly for Niger, Chad, and Mali, who are working with immense difficulty to fight terrorist and criminal organizations and the illegal trafficking linked to them, starting with the heinous trafficking in persons. In this context, we are convinced that the G5 Sahel initiative is essential, and we welcomed the decision of the G5 Sahel countries to launch, with the support of the African Union, a common force. Italy continues to assure the maximum support for the Horn of Africa, the key to stability for the entire region, and prey to a long and complex state of crisis aggravated, sadly, by climate change, which has produced a devastating drought. The initiatives in Somalia are moving in the right direction. Italy will continue to support it. I would be remiss, because of the ancient links to that land, our deep concern over the very serious situation in Venezuela, a situation that has turned a rich and prosperous country into a land of concern, crises, and suffering. Italy reiterates its appeal for an immediate and good faith dialogue which cannot disregard the four conditions set on the table: authorization to send international assistance, a clearly established electoral calendar, restoration to the parliament of its prerogatives, and the release of all political prisoners. Finally, in this moment, we are looking at the situation on the Korean Peninsula with great anguish, with great distress, in the face of repeated violations of the pertinent Security Council resolutions. It is fundamental for the international community to remain unified and determined in its response, and it is in this spirit that we promoted, as president of the G7, a firm group declaration. It is crucial to have full implementation of the pertinent Security Council resolutions. Every now and then someone wonders, what is the usefulness of the United Nations? The usefulness is of the United Nations in many things that are happening in the world, but the resolutions that we have achieved unanimously in recent weeks as an instrument of pressure toward the North Korean dictator are a positive result of the United Nations, that we are ready to cooperate with our partners to continue to exercise diplomatic and economic pressure needed toward the regime. With reference to the Iranian nuclear file, we believe that the international community should assure that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action remains a positive story in the framework of global efforts to counter the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. At the same time, we are convinced of the importance of a full and comprehensive application of Security Council Resolution 2231. Fellow delegates, Mr. President, autocratic regimes, terrorism, and international crises, environmental crises, are a grave threat to the situation of the planet. But we, the United Nations, cannot and will not give up this fight. The Secretary General has made prevention one of his highest priorities, and Italy supports him in this commitment. We need to prevent conflicts and the natural disasters and humanitarian and migratory crises that follow, which in turn are the cause of further instability. Prevention means everything except building barriers. It means instead achieving inclusive and sustainable development, and to addressing the difficulties and crises with a multilateral effort. We cannot do it alone before such threats. The response can only be a common response. Agenda 2030 outlines with clear-sighted ambition a common pathway. Together, we have written the prescription. Now we have to follow through on it. The same strong commitment is required from us in the fight against climate change. The Secretary General Gutierrez reminded us of this a few days ago when he said, if we don't deal with climate change now, we are going to ruin many of our grandchildren's opportunities to have a positive and dignified life. It is an emergency whose social consequences are not projected toward the future. They are already tragically evident. Just think of the more than 200 million displaced persons between 2008 and 2015 were forced to leave their homes because of the devastating effects of climate phenomena. The crises and challenges of our days can be overcome, and those of the future can be prevented. It depends on us, on the United Nations. We need an organization a United Nations that is more effective in enacting the principles that inspired it and that continue to be valid and relevant these many years later. We are thus counting on the Secretary General's leadership, and we fully support his reform plans, including his commitment to the empowerment of women and girls and the achievement of gender equality, also as a tool to strengthen the efficiency of the organization. This renewal framework clearly includes the reform of the United Nations Security Council to make it more democratic, more representative of the entire UN membership, because this membership, since the establishment of the United Nations, has evolved and expanded, and the same is required of the organ whose main charge is the executive. Fellow delegates, the current global scenario calls upon us to respond to many challenges, which demonstrate that history did not end a quarter of a century ago, as some had believed. We are called upon to constantly renew our endorsement of the values of peace, human rights, and democracy, and freedom. In other periods of our history, much more difficult than the one in which we are living, we have seen these values recede. But we know that also in the most difficult moments, democracy can revive and grow. And in the end, it can win. Thank you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I have to thank His Excellency Paolo Gentiloni, President of the Council of Ministers of the Republic of Italy, and I request protocol to escort His Excellency.